when we use that phrase tips and tricks, it's missing the point of the skills that students must have learned. Students are not graduating at rates they should be when they were accepted without test scores. Test scores really do tell you something about the student because there's so much grade inflation. I think practice tests are great, but students will eat through them. Parents have this mentality. If I just let my kids work on practice tests, they're going to get better. No, they're not. Much like if someone were to say, I want to increase by 10 points in 2 weeks, I would literally say to them, that is just never going to happen. And that's realistic to expect if you're doing that sort of process on the SAT to get you anywhere between 150 to maybe 200 points. But we don't sell dreams. I mean, in the sense of like unrealistic, ridiculous. We sell reality and practicality. And if something exceeds both of our expectations, well, great. But then I say, don't tell anybody about those results because I don't want anyone to know.
Amy Seeley has spent nearly 30 years inside the standardized testing industry. She's trained students, she's trained the professionals who train the students, and she's helped build the professional standards for the entire field. And she has some opinions that are going to surprise you about the digital SAT, test optional, and what most test prep is fundamentally broken. Stick around. This one is going to be loaded. Welcome back to Supported Learning Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Joseph Eschen. Families often ask me how to navigate the maze of college prep without spending a ton of time or wasting thousands of dollars. And it usually involves finding the people that have crafted the code that schools aren't telling you. And that's why I'm thrilled to welcome Amy Seeley here tonight to the podcast. Amy is the president of Seeley Test Pros, the founder of LEAP program, a curriculum used by schools and consultants nationwide, co-host of the Test and the Rest podcast, and founding member of the National Test Prep Association. She has been called a premier expert on standardized test preparation, and her core philosophy, what she calls test-taking literacy, is the SAT, ACT mirror of what we preach here for AP, skills mastery over content memorization. We're going to dive into the digital SAT, the test optional walkback, the psychology of test day, and why most test prep is built on the wrong model. Amy, welcome to the show.
Oh, so it's wonderful to be here. Looking forward to this conversation.
Absolutely. Even though we're apparently rivals because you're in Cleveland, Ohio.
Yeah, that's right. We did. Yes, I'm Cleveland, you're Pittsburgh.
But
Doesn't make for good friends.
That's okay. I am very, very impressed by the credentials. You've been doing this a lot longer than I have been doing this. But I guess, you've been in it for 30 years.
32 years.
32 years.
Yeah.
What is the pattern most parents are missing when it comes to standardized testing?
I think one of the things that we hear a lot is just give me the tips and tricks. It is very, very common for parents to express to us that's all they need are the tips and tricks. And given my history in the test prep industry, asking for that does make some sense. And that early in my career, especially with the SAT, there were things that were very much trick-oriented, if you will. But both the SAT and now the ACT have evolved. The SAT has gone through many iterations in my career, and I would 100% say when we use that phrase tips and tricks, it's missing the point of the skills that students must have learned. So it's sort of, I disappoint families sometimes. I'm like, no, we actually have to focus on like learning what those skills are as opposed to magical tips and tricks.
You were in the classroom, right? When did you leave the classroom?
No, I was never in the classroom.
Oh, you were in the classroom?
I graduated with an secondary ed degree in 1993 in May. And I started doing test prep in January of 1994. So I actually never, ever stepped foot in a classroom.
Well, if you had, here's what you would, this is the equivalent of just give me my work. I don't need to be in your class, Mrs. Seeley. I could just do my work. It's like, well, wait a minute. Sure. Why are wait, I love that. I'm just doing my work. I've heard that for my entire year in education. So it's like, just give me the tips and tricks. I don't want to learn. I want to just get this over with and then move on with my life. So, but
there is a little bit of that in test prep. I mean, there's a little bit of kids thinking, you can think really myopically and think that, oh, I'm just learning for this test. I just want to learn the things for the test and not understanding that we often see in the industry. When you do test prep, it sort of broadens your perspective about studying, how you approach studying. A lot of kids will pick up a lot of good study habits out of
Yeah.
doing test preparation that then can be transferable. We often say to high school or certainly college, which is what many of our students are anticipating, is trying to get into college. But right, some people can think, but it can be very much more than just tell me what I need to know for this, one section or one type of question.
Well, I love that you frame it in the form of literacy because test prep is a form of literacy in terms of knowing how to take the test, knowing how to do well on the test. Not to throw my credentials around, my dissertation was on mental health literacy, actually having the tools to access mental health supports
Sure.
education. But I go back to when I was teaching IB, and we literally became literacy based teachers in that we want to help you pass the papers of the test. All the papers of the test are writing. So you actually have to learn skills of literacy, which involves reading and writing and actually writing well. So you frame it in terms of test prep literacy. And I think you're absolutely right. Those skills are deeper learning skills that you can actually apply a multitude. And I actually was in my master's program while I was teaching IB. Teaching IB history, how to write, made me a better writer for my master's program. So what do you see it in terms of how you frame it in your program with test prep in terms of that literacy, and how do you explain that to families that are kind of new to this whole thing?
Well, I think there's a couple elements, one of which is obviously test familiarity, right? Part of the literacy is just knowing what are they going to test? How are they going to test it? And what ends up happening is you start with what the skills you teach to be efficient and to be effective. You start to align all of that instruction based upon what you know the test will test. So a good example of that might be like when it comes to like using commas, right? We might know that your regular English teacher might teach you 25 different rules for commas. But in test prep, maybe we're only going to teach you 5 of them and sort of say, don't mess with or think about those other 20 rules. So the idea is to make sure that they're very clear on what elements or what skills matter and in what order or in to what degree. Um, for example, in math, it could be you have to know if there's geometry. What elements of geometry do you have to make sure you remember what those geometry formulas are? Because in some tests, they're not going to provide them to you. And so part of the literacy is understanding the test framework. The second part is what are those skills that either I haven't learned, which usually they should have learned by junior year of high school, or what skills have I forgotten? Grammar is a good example of where most kids will learn it in 5th or 6th grade, and that's not a part of the high school curriculum. So understandably, a lot of students do not remember, like, how do I use colons? Or remembering, the distance formula in math. So some of those things are making sure they understand sort of what is the depth of knowledge that they will need, and what's required to make sure they know the way in which they need to know it.
Do you think most test prep is broken?
I think that so I am a founding board member of the National Test Prep Association. Prior to the podcast I had, there was no such thing as test prep people. The industry was fractured. Nobody knew anybody. And so, I helped to create the National Test Prep Association, which was founded in 2020, ironically, right before COVID started. And in that, I am now easily familiar with well over 300 or 400 different test prep companies in the country and even around the world. And I will say that I'm very hesitant to criticize any of my colleagues because they really wouldn't be in business if they weren't getting the job done. It's just that there's different ways in which I like to laugh. I think about pizza. There's so many different kinds of pizza anymore but that's not to say that on any given day, I like ordering different pizza. So different people can satisfy my pizza, taste buds or urges. So I do think that there's very different ways. I do think that there are some standards that test prep people should follow. For example, using official test material. If you're going to practice, make sure you are using the materials put out by the testing companies. So if someone's just writing and making up their own tests for everything, you can't really predict how the student's going to score. So I will say test prep that is focused on using official test materials should be a priority. If it's not, so for example, that means when somebody says they've been prepping out of the Princeton Review book, I sort of laugh because Princeton Review hasn't really been in the test prep industry for many, many years, despite the fact that publishing would show you differently. So in terms of fractured, I think it can be different in terms of in different parts of the country, some people's goals and what they're trying to accomplish are different, which means programs look different. You know, the typical student that works at my company does about maybe 10 hours of tutoring, maybe no more than 20. I mean, 20 is max. But you could go to other programs where they're selling you 40 hours of tutoring. Well, if someone takes 40 hours to teach you something, that says a lot about maybe how well they are at doing it. I mean, yeah, the more I do anything, hopefully eventually something's going to stick. So I think in the sense of over prescribing, the number of hours of preparation can sometimes be something that can be questionable, on the part of some test prep companies.
Yeah, I mean, it's something we struggle with because, so just to give you a little bit of my background, when I was teaching and I left teaching and became an administrator, and I was tutoring when I was teaching, and I left tutoring, and I got back into tutoring right around the pandemic, test prep online, and I was just throwing a bunch of kids for AP histories and was like told, hey, get them 4s and 5s in this amount of time. And I'm like, okay, real easy. So like I kind of developed my process of test prep out of necessity. And I'm like, it's really like 8 sessions. They have to review the curriculum. They have to learn the skills of what the test actually tests on the free response questions. And then they have to practice the test. And most kids that do that process, now the process is harder to follow than it sounds, but they can do well. They can most of them can score 4s and 5s, and that's pretty much what it's predicated on. It is kind of in the business side of things, you're fighting a little bit of an uphill battle because I think parents come to you with preconceived notions that this
They
much
can.
time equals this much success. And they just want to quantify everything as in, I pay this much, I get this much sessions and things like that. When I try to fight back of like, it is a process more than it
Well, and
is.
the big variable in this equation is the student, right? I mean, the
Right.
instructor can be the same, the materials or resources can be the same, but it's your student that comes to the process representing a lot of different variables. What starting score are they at? What math have they had? How much do they read independently? And so, what is the goal that they have? How much are they trying to improve? And as you said, like in what period of time? Think about it. I always like to use the analogy of weight loss and dieting, probably because both test prep and dieting is numbers, right? It's, a numbers, how many points, how many pounds, right? You can imagine if someone came to you and said, I want to lose 50 pounds in 2 weeks. It's sort of like you'd be taken aback and saying, well, that will never happen. Like that's virtually impossible. Much like if someone were to say, I want to increase by 10 points in 2 weeks, I would literally say to them, that is just never going to happen. And so sometimes we're fortunate enough that maybe the expectation is in 2 to 4 weeks, the next test date. The question becomes, how many more test dates do we have after that? So then I can say, well, we'll start and we'll try to build those skills going into this upcoming. Maybe we're going to only focus on one part of the test
Right.
in this next test. I think that's where, for example, for APs, it's very different. It's one shot. You take that AP test at the end of the year, you have to be 100% prepared on that one day. Whereas with SAT, ACT, you have multiple sections. You have many colleges that will super score. I mean, they'll take your highest individual section from any test and put it together. And then potentially a student starting starting in like winter of their junior year has potentially 6, SAT dates or 6 ACT dates in front of them with which to test. That is where we can then start to say, look, we'll do our best between now and this date. So sometimes what you're trying to do is kind of recalibrate the expectation. Now, that's not to say there haven't been students who've gone up 6 or 7 points in a month, but we don't sell dreams. I mean, in the sense of like unrealistic, ridiculous. We sell reality and practicality. And if something exceeds both of our expectations, well, great. But then I say, don't tell anybody about those results because I don't want anyone to know that if we magically increased that that's typical for the industry. But there are typical industry standards that I would say, you can kind of follow, which are such that, like I would say, if you start your test prep, you know, 10 to 12 weeks before your test date, that's a good timeline. If you're trying to do a practice test or practice sections every week, that's even better. Um, and that's realistic to expect if you're doing that sort of process on the SAT to get you anywhere between 150 to maybe 200 points. And the ACT, that's potentially going to get you 3 to 5 points more in the composite. Those are realistic standards.
I do not encourage my kids to take the May SAT. I think it's lunacy that the College Board has the May SAT 2 days before the AP exams start. We don't even really promote the June SAT that much. It's more like the it's just I just
Remember,
think
so just so you know, I know where you live by what you just said. If you were in New Jersey, people would say, well, what is the ACT? So, for example, there are ACT dates, there are SAT dates. Every college in the country will take either an SAT or ACT score. Some students will perform better on one test than the other. That's what actually is really the evolution of the work I do. Back in the day, when you went to college, the college dictated what test scores to send. So in Ohio, it was really commonly the ACT. But the minute you tried to apply to a school, East Coast, West Coast, then it might have been you must submit the SAT. All of that changed in 2007, where all colleges accept both. So now you see these regional preferences, but a really good test prep provider is going to try from the outset to determine, is one of these tests are you going to be better suited for one of these tests? The idea being, if we can get you the result you're looking for on one test versus the other, this is where, for example, ACT is not, they are February, they are April, they are June, July. They are not your May, right? They are going to be a little bit different. So some students, that might influence what their testing timeline or their testing preference might even be. But I agree with you. For certain students, it is problematic for May or June, very much. Those are the kids doing AP or IB. But that is not true if you're on a regular curriculum. In a regular curriculum, you want to wait till May or June till you're finishing like your Algebra 2. So it can really vary. And that's why, again, you want a test prep provider that asks you all these questions. Where do you go to school? What classes do you take? What are your grades? What colleges are you looking at? Where are you at score-wise? What is your goal score? And that really does influence advice that we give or we should give in test prep for what do we think the path of least resistance would be test-wise. And then, of course, possibly, do you need a test at all? Obviously with test optional, that influences some of students' decisions about doing test prep.
Yeah, we've talked about that on the podcast before, but just kind of obviously that was a pandemic era policy. A lot of people were celebrating it. Where you stand on it in terms of, I think the pendulum is swinging back the other way, in fact, pretty hard, but just where do you fall on that?
So I'm the mother of 5 kids, 4 of who've gone through this test prep in a college process. My 3 oldest were phenomenal testers. So that was just the kind of student they were. My 4th child, testing was never going to be in her future. She was a freshman when COVID hit. And there was no one celebrating test optional more, knowing that probably test optional would be something a path that she would probably pursue. Now, my daughter did test prep. She prepped for the ACT. She prepped over this sort of typical timeline, and she went up those 5 points in her composite. However, that did not nearly leave her with a score that was going to benefit her in the admissions process. So I do think while there's a segment of students who are going to benefit from test optional because there are still test optional colleges, the differences in the trend that you're speaking of is the implementation of a very widespread test optional policy early in COVID was simply as a response to the lack of access to testing, which obviously does not exist anymore, at least in most of the country. You'd be surprised, though, test access is an issue in California. There are states where students have to leave the state to take a test. California is still very much one of them. There's like a testing desert, if you will. But my point is, what colleges are finding, as you can imagine, is now that they've had enough graduates in a test optional admissions policy process to see students are not graduating at rates they should be when they were accepted without test scores. Students are not, so they're either taking more time They're dropping out. And so what they're recognizing is test scores really do tell you something about the student because there's so much grade inflation. The typical student at most of the high schools around me are getting a 3.75 or greater. So the student who has a 3.0 barely has a shot, And so the idea is that in order to be able to really differentiate what skills a student actually has, the tests are the only measurement. They're the only standardized measurement that really truly tell you, do they know it or do they not? And so that is something that no GPA is really able to do because it varies dramatically at schools what their grading scales are. And that's where when you talk about APs, there are a lot of kids who take the AP course for the grade bump, but they're getting ones, they're getting twos. So it's sort of like begs the question, why did you bother taking, for the college credit at least. So that's one of the things we see is students who just are still underprepared even if taking an AP because they aren't still able to do the skills that are a part of the class.
Okay, quick interruption. This is the part of the podcast where I'm legally required to remind you this show is brought to you by Support Ed Tutoring. Nobody's paying me to say that. I just work here. Well, I run the place, but still. Anyway, if you made it this far, you clearly have good taste. So do us both a favor and hit subscribe. That's it. That's the whole ask. And if you're the type who likes to skip ahead and just talk to a real person, we do that too. Book a call with our team. Link will be below. No pitch deck, no awkward sales script. I promise, just a conversation. Okay, back to it.
Well, I think it's also, we talk a lot about it inside the program too, of just like your A in the class does not equal 5. Does not. Like that grade can be based on literally anything. Homework, participation points, projects, nothing related to the AP standard. So,
well, and certainly things that think about a project. If you give a student a project in AP class and they have time to work on it, and let's say they're very hardworking, they're very motivated, they'll put so much time in. Those are things that very often in taking an actual test, you don't get do-overs. You don't get extra time. You don't get to go back and turn in corrections to your test. It doesn't work that way. Like it might work in some high school classes.
Well, I've seen a lot of teachers teach the FRQs that way, like a take-home DBQ. I'm like, you're not going to be able to do that in the test. Like you need to learn the skills first before you even release kids to do it on their own. Otherwise,
well, the hard part is you want to learn from your mistakes. So you want to understand why did you not do well on that FRQ. However, the grade you get should really just be what you got. Like, what did you give me? And that's the grade. Because that's what a test score is, right? That's what the AP does. That's what SATs on that given day, given those questions. Here's how you did in the moment. You don't get to go back and do it over. Well, you can retest, but then you got to put more time and effort into prepping.
To your point about grade inflation, there's so many competing forces out there. Like I had to do it as an IB teacher of like, I would lose kids would just drop out because the class would be too hard. I'm like, no, you can actually accomplish, you can do this, but you have to understand that what you know is not good enough and you actually have to grow during this process. But like we would grade their first essay the second day on the IB rubric, like showing them that they would fail, but the points are only out of 10 points. So even if you failed, you're not going to fail the class because it's only 10 points.
Right.
But I think there's I do think there's a lot of pressure on teachers to not drop kids out of the A because the GPA is going to mess up their future and the perception of the parents. And so really we have a declining population of they've never had higher scores and grades in their life.
They've never had high. No, if you look at the curves, if you look at the research, especially the curve for the number of O's or A's back in the 60s compared to now, the growth curve there is amazing with how many A's are being given out now. If you match or align that with test scores from SATs over that time, it is it's going down, So the problem is we can't say, oh, they're getting better grades. The kids today are getting smarter. The test would suggest the opposite. They have fewer skills.
I say this is a very non-PC thing I said. This is when I was a teacher. My first year teaching IB, I almost had no idea what was going on. I did not know what IB was. Thank God my kids were good writers because they knew how to write a well-structured essay. By my fourth year teaching it, I'm like, do you know how to do a topic sentence? We're going to start there.
Right.
And so the kids are actually getting, it's not, and it's we're teaching them less critical thinking. We're teaching them less critical writing.
So that's kind of where we're, enter test prep. That's why so many kids, when they're working on the tests, yes, the immediate goal is to get a higher number. But ultimately, I always say, parents will sometimes come back and say to me, thank you for making my student a better student. And that is actually the greatest compliment I can get as
Right.
an educator, because that's ultimately what we all want is leave this class with skills that are transferable in all kinds of places. And certainly the skills of reading and writing, you are definitely going to have to sort of produce those skills when you end up on a college campus.
Yeah, and I don't mean it as a disrespectful thing. I just think there is, like, I talked to my colleague in school the other day about, well, yeah, we're like, you have to, like, we talk about the legal system. There's like no consequences in law. Like, the court systems are not producing drug charges as much, not pursuing truancy. And I'm like, there's no consequences. I like, it's not hard to understand that. But like, the problem is, schools are right now the best provider of all social services, which all other social services have collapsed and have fallen on the school, which the school was never designed to provide, on top of like, oh yeah, by the way, have to do this, have to do that, have to do also teach at some point too.
Right.
And so there's
It's
just
a
a
challenge. I mean,
lot of,
to be a classroom teacher is a challenge I would never want to assume today. Like, I'm relieved that I never entered teaching in classrooms, because I don't know that I would still be a teacher.
that's forcing a lot of great teachers out. A lot of
Mhm.
teachers took the COVID exit. A lot of
Mhm.
teachers, like, it's just it's more and more pressure, but less and less of that, I think, gratification and reward. And it's a shame, because it's really, the entire system is kind of collapsing on each other. And I don't
And what's
know.
you mentioned earlier about writing about mental health or mental health literacy, and I think I don't take any issue with recognizing that students today are facing more mental health issues than any previous generation. And we really do try to keep that in mind. But at the end of the day, it's tricky when a parent says, look, I want this result, but I don't want to have them to have to be pressured. And it's
But
like, well,
that
which is it going to be? And so sometimes the tricky part is, I think the system has sometimes given in a little bit more than it should sometimes, which is why the kids then have expectations of they can get around things, or they don't need to do things, or there's a lot of shortcuts they can use. And it's very tricky sometimes, because we have to say, look, if you aren't able to put in that effort because of external things, that's totally fine, but you can't expect the result. You don't get the payoff without the work. And I think sometimes that's what's tricky, is we try to give allowances for things, and sometimes, which is totally fine and totally acceptable. I don't take any issue, but the expectation of outcome may have to be somewhat altered.
have you read the Coddling of the American
You
Mind
know what? I've
by
not,
Amy
I actually, that has been in my Amazon cart for longer than it should. I've not read it, but so many of my friends have. But yeah.
That's, he speaks on, like, it is. So I would just push back on that. Yeah, no, the stat that drew me to write my dissertation was, there was a study done in The Economist probably about now 15 years ago, and it showed depression and anxiety, it broken down by income levels, and like they
Mm,
have that like plot whisker diagram, and
mhm.
all three income levels, lower, middle, and higher, were experiencing higher degrees of anxiety and depression amongst teenagers than any other field. And it's like, why is that? I mean, one is this, the phone,
Phones, right? Sure.
and two, parents that and and I'm not saying, I have three daughters, and so
Mhm.
we want to always give them a better life and make, but like, also, and the point of the book is, we don't allow kids to fail safely anymore. We put
Learning how to fail is probably one of the most important lessons anybody can learn. The hard part is, it's like, how do you protect or soften it? I mean, it's an interesting thing, because it's an interesting lesson, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not trying to toot my own horn, but that was like the whole point of, we realized that, because, are you familiar with the IB curriculum?
We have podcasts on it. I mean, I know of things like, standard curriculum,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Shell, SL,
Yeah, yeah.
theory of
So
knowledge. I know sort of some
sure.
things, right?
So the challenge in Virginia, because that's where I was teaching, in Fairfax County, and we taught history of the Americas, which is
Mhm.
technically a U.S. history course, but it's history of all the Americas.
Right.
So you have to write 3 essays. You get 2.5 hours on There's 18 topics, 36 questions. And so one of the topics, you could choose a topic. So we chose Civil War, mainly because it only was US focused. And then two other questions or other two topics focused on Latin America or Canada. So we did Cold War, and then we eventually did civil rights. So the challenge was it was also a US survey course. They were tested on that. So we had to cover all of US history while going in depth on these three topics. And we spent literally 8 weeks on the Civil War. The problem was a kid could make it about 6 or 7 weeks into the class before their first real IB essay, because that's when we get through the causes of Civil War. And then we would just like devastate them with the score. And they're like, oh no. So we're like, we have to move this timeline up and basically like fail safely. Like, hey, you did summer work. You're going to write about Washington as a leader, and we're going to grade you on the IB rubric. But if you don't understand how to write, you're going to do poorly. And most kids are going to do poorly, but it's okay because we're going to teach you now how to get out of it as long as you change. And I just think we as a society it's just easier to give the kid a phone, like, right? It's easier to give the kid this. And again, you're a parent, so it's out of love. I hope it's out of love, but it's like we're shortchanging kids those learning opportunities when failure is not the end. It's actually, as you probably know, as a business owner, an entrepreneur, you can't fail. The only way you fail is if you quit. You actually just learn how to do something differently. You just learn how to figure this out. So I think schools are not great at teaching that right now.
I mean, I don't even want to get started on just, well, then what does AI throw into the mix? Because certainly that's, the last couple of years, that's a whole other thing of like students and what expectations we have now for their skill level given the access to AI. And I'm not denigrating AI. I'm just saying it poses a new challenge for students trying to gain the skill. It's very easy to try to use AI because I could say like you start to replace things you normally do with using AI.
Well, the same author talks about it because he's been John. I know let's say his name wrong. John Hattie. There's all this backlash against social media. He wrote the next book, The Anxious Generation, about media. So there's now countries passing bans on social media for kids having phones in schools. States are passing that, and he's saying, I think he was on Bill Maher. He was saying about we now have the same opportunity for AI. And I think, and so I've had guests on this podcast that are pro AI, anti AI for kids. And it's interesting because there's some discussion, at least in Pennsylvania, about potentially banning AI, all forms of AI for kids. And I think the only argument I have for it that it makes sense that I'm with is if you're going to basically outsource your critical thinking with AI, then absolutely. Because I think you and I grew up in a generation that didn't have phones or social media. So we actually know how to interact with humans without it. The same way as we're going to teach a whole bunch of kids that you could just ask your question to AI, and whatever the answer is, take its word for it, not think critically about it.
And I just finished a book called Co-Intelligence. It was written by a professor at Wharton. And I saw him speak, and it's really interesting because one of the premises is that when you take sort of average people, average thinkers, average in some way, it really increases like their capability. Like what they're now capable of is way better. Someone who starts with sort of above, obviously the improvement for them is going to be less. But one of the challenges is these gaps of age. Like you and I could say, we gained our experience right on the battlefield of like working it, doing it, learning through failing, learning through iteration. To get where we are, we can use AI in a powerful way because we can evaluate what it's doing and whether it's right or wrong, or we use our own experience to sort of put it in context. But how do you get to be where we are? You have to sort of go through the work to gain the context. So there's a little bit of, I think, in education is how are we going to teach our students to use it in a way that it is only going to be an addition to, or it's only going to augment education. But obviously, sadly, we know that there's going to be a lot of places where it doesn't do that.
All right, Amy, you ready for lightning round to round this out?
Lightning round. Oh, there we go.
All right. Most overrated thing about ACT or SAT prep that everyone obsesses over?
Everyone obsesses over taking lots of practice tests. Now, I think practice tests are great, but students will eat through them Some students will just go, oh, the more I do, the more I do. And parents have this mentality. If I just let my kids work on
Yeah.
practice tests, they're going to get better. No, they're not. If you do not learn from your mistakes, you cannot expect to get better. And so I would say probably the notion of simply just taking tests is what makes you better. And I would argue, no, it's the review and it's the deconstruction of your error in between that is what you evaluate and you learn from in that next time you take a test.
I like that. You're actually really true. Most underrated thing nobody talks about that actually moves scores.
Some memorization. I mean, there is really some rote memorization. And I think that's actually where some students are falling short. The typical student, let's say, who takes geometry, their geometry teacher has never expected them to retain any one of those rules or formulas. When you get
Okay.
to a test like the ACT, and you have to know distance formula, midpoint formula, slope formula, equations of lines, parabolas, circles, ellipses, hyperbolas, you got to know the memorization. And so that's what's tricky is I want my students to be critical thinkers, but it has to be based upon some actual knowledge.
Bloom's taxonomy right there. Foundation
Exactly.
will be where you build. If you could whisper one piece of advice to a parent of an eighth grader about how to think about testing over the next 4 years, what would it be?
Without hesitation, read more, and read more nonfiction, 15 minutes a day. We make our kindergarten, first and second, sometimes third graders do 15 minutes a day where us parents have to sign off on it. The stats for how little kids really read by the time they hit high school. So reading more and reading more nonfiction.
And what's the next big shift coming in standardized testing that no one is talking about yet?
Big shift coming. It's funny. I recorded a podcast. Our second podcast was me talking about testing past, present, and future. It's a funny episode to listen to now because that was in early 2019. And so much has changed since we recorded that. But I would say a trend. A trend in terms of test prep is, can AI prep you for a test as well as a human? Because there are a lot of elements of things we all do as humans in test prep that AI, at least at this point, might not have sort of sentience over. So think even like looking at a student as you work with them and noticing certain things about what they're thinking, what they're doing, what they're touching, what they're writing, that I can stop them in their tracks because I know where it's going. So I can predict a lot of behaviors because I've seen them. I don't know whether AI will do that, but it's certainly if at a point in time comes where it can, that would be the concern. So understanding how AI is able to engage or act eventually as compared to human tutoring, teaching.
Well, Amy, this has been incredible for families and educators and others that want to learn more and go deeper with what you offer. Where should they find you? Where can they find
So
you?
you can always find me at our website, leapprogram.com. That's leaprogram.com. And the About Us page is where you can find me.
All right. And before we wrap, what's one thing you want every parent listening to remember from this conversation?
Test scores are about skills. And if you want your students to succeed, make sure they have the skills.
Awesome. All right, Amy. Thank you again. Pleasure getting to know you. And thank you all for tuning in to the Support Learning Podcast. We'll see you next time.